On the 7th of August 1941, in front of a huge crowd in Zhytomyr in Ukraine, two judges were led to the gallows by the Nazi SD, and they were then executed in front of a huge crowd of people. These were men who had suffered greatly throughout the launching of Operation Barbarossa, and they were just two victims of millions of the Nazis as Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union. A number of those that day were forced to watch the executions of Mosche, Kogan and Kieper, and these were prisoners who were made to do so by the German army before they were to march to their deaths and were shot by German soldiers. Join us today to look at the executions of the Ukrainian judges of Zhytomyr, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. When the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa, their invasion into the Soviet Union, even Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, was shocked and surprised. Previously, the two nations had agreed to a non-aggression pact, and it was believed that they would not fight each other for at least 10 years under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But when the Germans rampaged into the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, it would be the largest land offensive in history, with over 10 million soldiers taking part. The plan was to conquer the western part of the Soviet Union, and then to repopulate it with Germans as part of the Lebensraum or living space programme, as Hitler wanted Germans living in lands to the east. The Nazis also wanted to acquire resources for their war effort, and they wanted the oil reserves of the Caucasus region, and also the agriculture in the areas, to feed their soldiers and also people back home. They would, though, have murderous intentions, and they wanted to exterminate the native Slavic people, and to also continue the persecution of the Jews in lands which they would seize. The operation had been planned for around a year, and to begin with 3.8 million Axis forces would invade the Soviet Union, along an almost 3,000 kilometre front, and they were supported by 600,000 vehicles, including tanks and artillery, and they also had over 600,000 horses at their disposal. But during the offensive, the Eastern Front would open up, and this would see the most brutal and bloody battles in the whole of the Second World War. Some of the battles fought here, such as Stalingrad and Kursk, saw a huge amount of bloodshed, and cities such as Leningrad were forced into years-long sieges by the German forces, in which the civilian population starved to death and suffered heavily. Things were very tough on that front, and one German soldier wrote of his experiences, saying, "Heavy fire starts as expected around 0500 hours. I'm sitting in B position, Beobachter or observer, and am able to see our impending doom as no one else can. The sap, the short trench dug from the front trench, is right at the edge of the forest. From here the terrain slopes gently down to the Veta River. That damn river looks like it will drink a lot of blood, perhaps mine too. Behind the river is an enormous anti-tank trench filled with barbed wire, well-camouflaged bunker lines to the trench. The firing is coming from them, death is rolling towards us. A crushing wall of fire slowly crawls very slowly up the hill. These Schweins shoot with precision that could only have been learned through intensive training. Halfway up the hill, the firewall now reaches a tree-covered farmhouse. Cracking and splintering is heard when the tree branches, wooden beams and bricks go swirling through the air. The stinking firewall moves on. Do not lose your nerves now, Hans. I estimate that death will be arriving any minute soon. Everybody has been warned. We claw our fingers into the dirt. We have sweat on our foreheads out of fear. God, if we were able to defend ourselves. And then all hell breaks loose. There is a howling, an enormous roar, thundering, cracking, and the humming of thousands of splinters. Foul-smelling smoke floods into our trench. Did this last seconds or minutes? I cannot say. I pull my nose carefully out of the dirt to see that the firewall has moved on. I remain deaf for minutes. There is something wet on my face, blood. Thank goodness it is just a scratch. Our position is in chaos. The tree trunk we used to cover has been torn to shreds. Portions of trenches have been filled back up with dirt. One position received a direct hit. 2 comrades were killed and 3 were wounded. Overall we were lucky. It could have gone worse. The Germans initially had successes. They would capture around 5 million Soviet Red Army soldiers, and then around 3.3 million prisoners of war were deliberately starved by them, or they had them executed. Some Red Army commissars were sent to concentration camps, where they were then slaughtered inside makeshift killing chambers, but the Germans wanted to kill as many as they could without firing a bullet as they implemented the hunger plan. This would solve German food shortages and exterminate civilians and natives through starvation, but after advances by the Wehrmacht, Nazi death squads would arrive in villages, towns and cities, and they would cause chaos. The Einsatzgruppen were paramilitary SS execution squads who would tail the Wehrmacht offensives, and when they captured lands, they would deal with the civilians. In Soviet territory, they would slaughter millions. They would order civilians out of their homes before ordering many to dig graves on the edges of their settlement. Following these pits being dug, the victims were then led into the pits where the executioners stood with their weapons on the edge, and they would then shoot them. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in this manner, but months after the launching of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis would rampage into Ukraine, and specifically into the city of Zhytomyr. The city would, during the war, become home to Heinrich Himmler's Ukrainian headquarters, and it was said of this that the district was a laboratory for Himmler's resettlement activists. The elimination of the Jews and German colonisation of the East transformed the landscape and devastated the population to an extent that was not experienced in other parts of Nazi-occupied Europe besides Poland. Whilst ultimately the war effort and mounting partisan warfare behind the enemy lines prevented Nazi leaders from fully developing and realising their colonial aims in Ukraine. In addition to the immediate destruction of all Jewish communities, Himmler insisted that the Ukrainian civilian populations be brought to a minimum. But inside of the city, the SS and the SD would establish their rule and regime on the people of the city, and they would then organise mass executions of the population of Zhytomyr. They would round up and arrest Jews inside of power and high-profile jobs, and many of them were then executed. Two of those who suffered horrifically were Mosche Kogan and Kieper. These two men were members of the Soviet Regional Court, and they were rounded up as they were both Jewish. The Nazis targeted those Jews who were in positions of power, and these were then executed. Kogan and Kieper were arrested by the SD at the beginning of August 1941. They were then tortured and imprisoned for a short period. However, at the same time, there were more than 400 Jewish men who had been rounded up by the Germans, and the commander had then gathered these men in the market square in Zhytomyr, where many people were also there to witness. In the square was a huge gallows that had been made, and Mosche Kogan and Kieper, the two Jewish judges, were led out by German soldiers. There was a van parked underneath the gallows. Then the former judges, who were wearing rough-looking clothes, were ordered to climb on the back of the truck. The roof of the vehicle formed a scaffold, and then with many looking on, the death sentence was read out. With the 400 Jewish men looking on, and thousands more civilians, the executioners placed the ropes around their necks and final checks were made. Let's remember that these two men, in the eyes of the law, hadn't done anything wrong, except the fact they were Jewish and in positions of power. The order was then given for the trucks to back away, and they reversed away and the two former judges were left hanging. The Nazis utilised executions like this in public to terrorise the population, and more of this would happen, as the 400 Jewish men that were gathered were then marched following the hangings to the horse cemetery outside of Zhytomyr. Following this, they were then shot and were executed by the SD and the German soldiers. The executions of the Ukrainian judges and civilians of Zhytomyr were shocking, and they aimed to terrorise the population inside of the city. Mosche Kogan and Kieper were victims of the Nazis and their brutal persecution of the Jews inside of Soviet cities and towns, and they would be two of millions who were slaughtered or were then sent to concentration camps. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.